Today we're going to look at some of the basics of Angular templating. So the first template, or the first tag, that we're going to have a look at is the ng template tag. So this is a virtual Angular template element for rendering HTML. It has no presentational value and does not render until it's ready, i.e. that it's being targeted by a structural directive, and we'll look at structural directive shortly. So in the example down here, we've got our div tag here will only get displayed if this particular variable of is logged in evaluates to true. Our second container that we're looking at is another built-in container for Angular. So the ng container is an element that can act as a host to structural directives. We can only add, and I said we'll get into structural directive shortly, but we can only add one structural directive per element. So we can't do this by stacking up a number of structural elements, or structural directives, for an individual element. So what we can use the ng container for is to actually create a wrapper to go around a particular item, which will not be actually injecting any HTML of its own into the document, but can be used as the wrapper to be able to do our structural directives on for sub bits of information. So for directives, so there's three kinds of directives in Angular. We've got components, which are directives with a template. We have structural directives. So structural directives change the DOM layout by adding or removing DOM elements. And we have attribute directives, which change the appearance or behavior of an element, component, or other directive. So the two that we're probably going to look at now will be the structural directives and the attribute directives. Remember, structural is there about adding or removing elements, and attributes is about changing the appearance or behavior of an element. So our first Angular structural directive we'll look at is the if statement. So this will allow us to add or remove an element from the DOM. We have within Angular a sugar syntax, a shorthand syntax that we can use for defining an if statement. And I've also representing here how that is actually used in a desugared sort of syntax. So our short syntax, so within our div tag, using the star character there for the ng if. So if show is equal to true, then this content of this tag would be displayed. So that's the shorthand syntax. So what this will be converted to would be something like this. So we just looked at the ng template before, so it would create the ng template as a wrapper around some particular content, which was our div, and we're using a property binding to link if this show variable is true, then we will display the information that's inside. Another structural directive is the ng if else. So this is a step on from our ng if. So we have the option here to say our if show is true, then we would show this particular bit of content, else option 2. And so this becomes a sort of a named variable in another template below. So if show is true, we would see some text, or this version of some text. If it wasn't true, then we would see this block of text down here. Okay, we've got the next structural directive, which is the ng_for. So this is basically a repeater. So it's a way to present a list of items. So where items is an array of, in this case, array of objects. So what we're looking here, and there's a micro syntax that we use here to define this. So this is let item, so define a variable item of items, so that each time it loops through an item in the array, the that particular item in the array will take on the variable name of item, and then we can use our bindings to display that item or some property of that item in the in this case the ally tag. So we only need to be able to display an entire list of items. We need this one line, and it will iterate through the items array, displaying all the items in a list. We have a couple of other handy little variables that we can use with our for loop. In this case, we have index and count, where index will represent the current list item, and given that this is coming from a zero-based array system, the first item will be at position 0, and count is basically the length of the array, how many items in the array. So we could have something where we said this would be for the first time we come through the loop, so it'll be 0 plus 1, so it'd be the first of, and if you had 5 items, so the first of 5, and then it would display the item name. The next time it came through the loop, it'd be 1 plus 1, so it'd be the second of 5. So we do have these handy variables here if we want to use those in some sort of display. Only, and as I repeated from before, you can only have one structural directive per element. So we can't stack up an ngIf and an ngFor in the same item. Another structural directive, or actually we've got 2 structural directives and an attribute directive. So the ngSwitch, so if you've done any programming before, you've got a switch statement or a case statement, you may have heard of it before. So basically, based on the value of some item from our component or model, it will switch that, and depending on the case values, so if we had our item color was red, then this particular part would be displayed. If our item color was, well, we should be green, but if it is green, then this one would be displayed. If our switch was neither red nor green, then we have the option of showing a default, and then that part would actually be displayed. So property binding. We've actually seen some uses of property binding already, and sort of skipped over that, but property binding is the process of passing data from our component class and setting the value of a given element in the view. So property binding is one way. So it's information coming from our component and being used in our view. So Angular has attribute directives. Attribute directives let us change the appearance or behavior of a DOM element. So we can build a complex styling behavior, and we'll be able to apply it to an element by adding an attribute to a HTML tag. So if you've done HTML coding before, you'd know about attributes within a tag. So we have a few commonly used built-in attribute directives. The first is ngStyle. So this allows us to add or remove a set of HTML inline styles. And then we've got the other one there, which is the ngClass. So this allows us to add or remove an entire class to our particular HTML tag. So the ngStyle would be effectively adding a style attribute, and with whatever styling we want. And the ngClass is about adding or removing classes from a particular HTML tag. And you'll note that they both use the square bracket syntax, that is a one-way binding, which takes information from the component and displays it in the view. We've got one other attribute, built-in commonly used attribute directive, which is the ngModel. Now you'll notice it has slightly different syntax, and they call this banana in a box syntax, given that we have our 2 round bananas in a square box. So this is a two-way binding to a HTML form element. So where the square brackets is binding from the model to the view, and the round brackets is binding an event handler from the view. So this way we can have, whenever we change the value of a property in our component, it will be reflected in our view, and if we change it in our view, it will also then get reflected in our component. Importantly, if we want to use the ng model, we must import the forms module, and we can see what the import looks like here. So it's import forms module from the @angular/forms. So if we're using ng model, we need to have our forms module. So this, you'll notice here with our banana in a box that this is a sort of a shortcut syntax to what this would have been, which would be a property binding of ng model to the variable foo from our component, and then we would then be doing the reverse, so taking information from our particular view and bringing it back into our component based on an event. So this is sort of a shortcut for it. We can use this notation of ng model and ng model change would do exactly the same thing as this does. So Angular has an ability for us to create custom attribute directives. So we don't have to stick with those three different built-in commonly used directives. We can actually create our own so that we can apply an attribute to a particular tag, and that attribute will have some effect on how this tag is going to be created. We use an ng-g for generate directive, and then the name of the directive we want to use. So the Angular CLI will append the app prefix. So we notice that we have app highlight here to the name of the directive. So this is to ensure that we don't have any conflicts with any existing HTML attributes. We don't want to be creating an attribute here that already exists or might exist in the future in a HTML language. So it will automatically add app to make sure that it's in its own namespace and we can avoid conflicts. Template reference variable. So a template reference variable is often a reference to a DOM element within a template. So in the particular example here, we have an input tag of type text, and we've given it a reference variable of example zip code. We can then make a reference to this particular tag in code then when we want to say, we might have a particular function or something where we want to pass in the zip code. So zip code gets a reference to the entire node item, and so if we want to find out what the value of the input was, we would call zipcode.value. The reference variable has scope for across the entire template that we're currently in. So we are able to reference it from any other item or DOM object within that particular template. We have an alternate syntax available to us. So instead of putting the hash zip code, we can also use ref-zip code, would do exactly the same thing. Let's have a look at some of these structural and attribute directives in use inside some code. So what you'll see here is an extension of your week 6 tutorial where you're creating a basic chat system using sockets. In this case, I've created an extra component here which contains my examples. The styling for this, if you want to know what I was using for that, is just using some basic Bootstrap. So if you want to add the very basics, vanilla Bootstrap to your website, the easiest way in this at the moment is to come into your index.html file and basically add in the CDN, so Content Delivery Network links for Bootstrap. So we need to put in a link for jQuery, the Bootstrap CSS file, and the Bootstrap JavaScript file. So by adding those in, they're then available across all of our app. and we can make use of some of the nice Bootstrap goodness for doing some styling. So let's back to our example. So here you'll see my example component that I've added, and we'll have a look at, don't want to say that, we'll have a look at the component class, where we'll set some variables that we can then display back in our view, and our view with the examples in them. So our first one we'll have a look at is the use of an ngIf. So in this case here, we've got a div tag using the star ngIf. So this is our sugar syntax, our shorthand syntax for an ngIf. So an if is logged in as a variable is true, then we should see this particular tag. If it's false, we don't. So if we come back and have a look at our page, at the moment we can see here our example of ngIf, and we can see I am logged in. If we come back to our code and into our component, we'll see at the moment in our component class is logged in as true. If we set that to false, and at the moment I'm running my Angular app using ngserve on port 4200 on the local host, so that it will rebuild itself and run every time I save, so I don't have to go back and do a build every time. So we'll come, now that we've set it as false, we'll notice that that bit of text is no longer there. Come back, set that to true. We now see that I am logged in is back there again. So that's a simple use of the ngIf. So let's look at the next bit of a ngIf and then an else statement. So we've got, what we're seeing here is the sort of longhand version of it. So here we looked at the shorthand version of doing this. The longhand version of doing a ngIf is using this property binding of ngIf on the variable is logged in, and our ngIf else is then going to go to a named template down here and display this. So if this value is true, we'll see welcome back friend. If it is false, then we will see please friend log in. So let's go back to here. So at the moment it's saying welcome back friend because it was true. And if we set it to false again, then it's now saying please friend log in. So that's what our if then else is capable of. We have a couple of different syntaxes for creating our ngIf. So we could use the ngIf as the sugar syntax within the tag itself. But we have an alternate syntax, another one, where we can put the word bind-ngIf as opposed to putting it inside the square brackets that we have up here. We'll do exactly the same thing as what we had up before. Let's have a look at our ng4. So this one is being based off an array of objects that I have in here. So basically just storing a name and a city, and for one of these I've added an extra one of a URL. But basically looking at just a name and a city of a series of objects there being stored in this lists array. So what we're going to do, we're going to define a local variable called list of our lists. So each iteration of this li tag, because we'll be repeating this li tag. So for each iteration, it will take the next item in the lists array. We're also going to define a variable I, which will represent the index value, and create another one, C, which will represent the total number of items in our list array. So when we're displaying this, I'm using my interpolation tags, so data binding stuff using the double squiggly brackets. So here we're going to take I, given that the arrays are a zero-based numbering system, so I plus 1, so that the first one, instead of being 0, is 1. So this will be saying 1 of however many items in the array, 1 of 5, and we're then going to create a link on the person's name, which will take them back to a login page, and then also display the city value of the list. So if we see that running, what we're seeing here is we're seeing this is 1 of 5. We'll have a link which takes you back to the login page and then their city. So if we clicked on that one, we should come back to the login for doing the chat. Okay, the next example. So examples of property binding syntax. With the joys of it, they give us 3 different options for how to create doing property binding syntax. The first one is using the double squiggly brackets. Does a one-way binding from the component to the view. We also have the square bracket notation, which does a one-way binding from the component to the view. And we can also use this bind dash onto the value, does exactly the same thing. So all 3 of these are equivalent in what they can do. And our last example, and not directly related with our with the directives of the structural and attribute directives, but something else to note is the use of pipes. So pipes allow us to take in data and transform them to be a different output when they come out. There is a range of built-in pipes in Angular, one being this one here, which is uppercase. So this will take our username and convert it all to uppercase via the pipe. And we can see that in use here. Hang on, our name appears here. We need to have a username. So if we come back to our page, we can create a username, which will be a string, and let's make it equal to that. So if we save that, it should come back here. We'll now see our username all in caps. Our last item to look at is a custom attribute directive. So remembering in our PowerPoint that we looked at before, to create a custom attribute directive, we use the ng-g directive and the name of the directive. So in this case, I have an example here where I created a directive called highlight. So the point of this directive is by putting in the tag or the attribute inside a HTML tag of app highlight, we're going to apply some particular styling to that particular element. So in this case, we're going to set its background color to a gray. We'll set the font color to white, and we will set some padding around that element of 1 em. If you're not sure what ems are, an em is a relative measurement based on the width of the letter M, given that it is the widest one in the English language. When we move our mouse over that particular area, the color will change, and we're passing in 2 variables for that, because you notice we'll call this dot highlight. Highlight is a private function here that takes in 2 colors, one which is the background color, the other is the foreground color, where we will then change the styling of the background color and the foreground color based on the values that were passed in. So here, this dot highlight will change the background color to yellow, and the foreground color will become blue. When our mouse leaves an area, we will then set our background color back to the gray that we had originally, and the foreground text will come back to the white that we had originally. So let's have a look at that directive inside our component. Just mention on the imports for this. So we're importing directive, the element ref, which allows us to get our reference to the elements that we're targeting through here. That's brought in through our constructor. And we also bring in the host listener to be able to handle the mouse enter and mouse leave events. So in our code to implement this, the first one we had it on, if I remember, was on this particular tag here. So in the example of the ng if else, I've added in the div and the app highlight. So if we have a look at that one running, as we roll over, we're not going to see anything at the moment because we're actually not looking at the right tag. We need to go and change our, because at the moment this is looking for if is logged in is true. We would see this one, which it is not at the moment. Is logged in is false. So let's go and change that back to true. Save that back to here. And let's have a look now. So our item here has the grey text background. It has the white font color. And as we roll over it, the background becomes yellow and the text becomes blue. Now I've got this same attribute also applied to an example on one of the images here. So I've added this attribute to my image tag, which is what we have on this one. So given that we have no foreground text, we're not going to see any of the white or blue text, but the background color does change from the gray to the yellow as our mouse goes in and out.